Hi everyone, my name is Nick Collins. I am the Tuba Representative and Co-Director of the Atlanta Low Brass Academy. Today we're going to be talking about the 2021-2022 GMEA All-State Symphonic Band Lyrical Etude for tuba. So let's get started here. First, let's take a look at our key signature. We've got 4 flats, so we're in A flat major. Not a super foreign key to a lot of us, but it's always a great idea to go ahead and just review that A flat major scale before you start cracking on this etude, and especially watch out for those D flats, right? We are in 6/8 here with the dotted quarter equaling 48 beats per minute, okay? So we're thinking big beats here. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, right? So that dotted quarter is 3 eighth notes, and there's 2 in each bar. So we want to be thinking big beats as far as feel goes, okay? Now, when we put on the metronome with our dotted quarter equals 48, if we can, let's go ahead and add in that 3 eighth note subdivision here, right? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, to make sure that we're really in time in all parts of each measure, right? This is a lot of time between these, right, to move around and kind of play with the time, but we don't necessarily want to do that, right, because that doesn't bode well for us later. So let's get that subdivision on and make sure that we're also emphasizing these big beats here. Okay, so next to that tempo marking, you see waltz. Right, so a waltz is a dance, usually in some sort of triple meter. It's always a good idea to go ahead and just look it up. It's a dance, and it's a good idea to watch a waltz or two to kind of get a good visualization of what you're going to be doing in this etude. And another element to that is, because this is a dance and it's a waltz, I like to imagine that there's a group of dancers doing a waltz to my music here. And as far as rubato goes and playing with the time, it would be really tough for them to dance to the music I'm giving them if I'm really messing with the time all the way around. So I think more so than not, go ahead and stick to the time and stick strictly to those subdivisions as well. I think that's going to be more appropriate than not. Okay? Now, when talking about triple meter, there's a hierarchy of emphasis when it comes to the beats in a grouping of 3 notes, okay? And in this case, there's 2 groupings of 3 notes in each measure, okay? So we're just going to talk about one grouping of 3 notes, but it applies to all groupings of 3 notes in this 6/8 feel. But there's a hierarchy of emphasis, okay? So, of course, beat 1 is going to be the most, right? It's going to be the most important. The most emphasis is going to be on that big beat, that downbeat, and that's going to be our dotted quarters in this 6/8. That's beat 1. That's the emphasis on beat 1, okay? The second most important is going to be beat 3, okay? Because beat 3 is leading back to beat 1. And without beat 2, there's still a pretty good sense of a waltz happening here, right? Cha, 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 cha. 1, 3, 1, 3, 1. 3, 1. And notice how I was saying 3, 1 and not 3, 1, right? 3 is always leading back to 1, so it's second most important. Now, beat 2 is going to be the least emphasized. That doesn't mean that it's not important at all, but we're not going to have as much emphasis or leading going on necessarily with beat 2 in this particular etude. Okay, so keep that in mind when you're practicing this etude and when you're performing it. Okay, now let's take a look at dynamics. There's 3 different dynamic levels written on this etude. We have mezzo piano to start out in measure 1. And then we have a crescendo in measure 7 going to big beat 2 of measure 8, and we have forte there. And then we have a decrescendo happening in measure 12 going down to mezzo forte in measure 13 to finish out, okay? Now, this is gonna be the bare minimum of what you do dynamically with this etude. And I think it's important to try and do as much as you can with dynamic contrast to tell an interesting story with an etude like this, where we're not necessarily going to use the time and rubato to have emphasis and tell a story with these phrases, okay? So, at the very least, let's take a look at measure 7 and 8, right? We have this crescendo here, technically starting from mezzo piano, going all the way up to forte. Okay, that's going to be the biggest dynamic contrast that we see in this etude. So make it apparent, right? Don't give the judges any reason to say that you didn't show dynamic contrast there. That doesn't mean go to, fortissimo and play as loud as you can when you get to measure 8, but make sure that there is a definite sense of 2 dynamic levels lower going to 2 dynamic levels higher, right? And that's especially true because you see on that big beat 2 there, you see that E natural, that it's accented and it's tenuto. So that's definitely an important highlighted moment in this etude. And we'll come back to that in a second here. Now, one place where I added my own kind of flair, my own little dynamic thing was from measure 13 to measure 15. As you can see, it's actually, the actual shape of the notes is ramping up and coming back down, right? And that high B flat is going to be one of the most special moments in here as well. So I wanted to highlight that a little bit more. So I added my own little crescendo from measure 13, going all the way to that big beat 2 of measure 14, highlighting that B flat and then coming back down and finishing out the etude in a really good resolute manner. And I think it highlights that B flat a little bit more so than if you did nothing, right? Wonderful. Of course, where that decrescendo is written in measure 12, absolutely do it. I overdid mine a little bit in my recording, and that was intentional. I wanted to make sure that it was known that was actually decrescendoing and I was going to a different dynamic level there. Okay? Wonderful. Now, let's talk about breathing in this etude. If you see, there aren't any fermatas, there aren't any rests in this etude except for the last small beat, the last 8th note there in the last measure. There's your rest, but by that point we're kind of donezo. So I would definitely aim for the dotted rhythms here for your breaths. If you can make other places make sense, then that's okay as well. I think as a default, definitely aim for the dotted rhythms if you can. So yes, and then let's take a look at measure 8 specifically. This is an interesting one. So you see on big beat 2 of measure 8, we have that E natural there. That's accented with a tenuto, right? So it needs to be full value and accented, have a natural decay to it. Now, when you see that tenuto, even my initial reaction is, I do not want to breathe after that E natural because there's a tenuto, so where else can I breathe? And I was experimenting with that, and I found that it sounds odd to keep that going all the way through and find different places to breathe, because it started breaking up phrases that I didn't necessarily want to break up around it, okay? Now, I breathed after that dotted quarter, even though it's accented with a tenuto, because that crescendo is happening from measure 7 only to that E natural in measure 8, that big beat 2. So I think as long as you make a big enough deal about that E natural, because we're kind of changing tonality here, if you make a big enough deal about that E natural and you get a full frog to tip, as if you're a cellist, frog to tip stroke on that note and give it enough length, I think it's okay to breathe and then start in this new tonality that you're exploring here. I think you can easily get away with that and make it very effective. Okay, the last thing I want to talk about here is measure 4, right? So we have this first phrase from measure 1 to measure 4. And if you look at measure 4 and you listen to measure 4, it sounds a bit odd or a bit rushed coming out of this measure, okay? Because we have A flat, which is home base on beat 1, big beat 1 of this measure. Great, makes sense, okay? And then on big beat 2 here, we have E flat, which is our soul, right? Makes sense in a lot of areas. That's totally fine to have that kind of emphasis on a big beat with that dominant there. But we see that we're resolving this first phrase on a weak beat on that A flat going into, I guess you would say, small beat 5 of this measure. And it feels a little odd, okay? I was actually, when I first started working on this etude for this series, I was adding an extra eighth note at the end of that measure because that felt more correct to me. I was playing an extra eighth note at the end, or holding it on that A flat, because that felt correct in a lot of ways. But you know, when you put it back on the metronome, you realize, oh, I've messed up the meter here. I've messed up the flow of the meter. So absolutely go with the metronome and go with what's written on the page there, even though it may feel a little odd. Isolate that measure by itself, and then add in, going on to the next phrase in measure 5, to feel kind of the oddity of it and feel what that flow is, and of course go with what's on the page, and I think it'll be just fine there. Okay, so of course have fun with this, keep it moving, keep the motion going, keep it dancing, and I think this etude will be a lot of fun for you. So I hope this video was helpful, and best of luck on the audition.